There are places that towns forget on purpose, not because nothing happened there, but because too much did. We want to tell you about a place like that. A boathouse at the end of Pelican Spit Road, on the eastern shore of Keppoch Lake, in a small town in Nova Scotia that most maps didn't bother naming correctly. The boathouse had been empty for 11 years when Celeste Aumont— No, wait. We have to start before the boathouse. We have to start with the girl. Her name was Delia Marsh. She was 21 years old, and she had $37 in her coat pocket, a canvas roll of woodworking chisels tied to her backpack, and no idea where she was going to sleep that night. If you had seen her walking down the gravel shoulder of the highway that October, you might have thought she was a student heading back to campus. She had that look, purposeful stride, eyes forward, like she knew where she was going even when she didn't. But look closer and you'd see the backpack was too heavy. The boots were wrong for the season. And there was something in the way she held her jaw, tight, controlled, that wasn't youth. That was someone who had decided very recently that she was not going to cry on a public road. 3 days before, her uncle, Gordon Marsh, the man who had taken her in at 15 after her mother passed, had stood in the kitchen of the house she'd lived in for 6 years and told her she had until Friday to be gone. His new wife wanted the spare room for a nursery. That was it. No argument, no apology, just the information, delivered like a weather report, while he kept his eyes on the television. Delia had nodded, packed, left. She didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. What she did have, wrapped in that canvas roll, were the chisels that had belonged to Albert Foss. Albert Foss had been her mother's neighbor, then her mother's friend, then, after her mother got sick, the man who came over on Saturday mornings and taught Delia how to work with wood. He'd been a Finnish carpenter for 40 years. The kind of man who could look at a warped door and know without measuring exactly what was wrong with it. He taught her the names of joints: dovetail, mortise and tenon, box joint. The way another person might teach a child their prayers. Carefully, like it mattered. He died 2 years after her mother. Left her nothing in writing. He had no will, but his daughter had found Delia at the funeral and pressed the canvas roll into her hands and said, "He would have wanted you to have these." That was the only inheritance Delia had ever received. She'd been working odd jobs since then. Waitressing, cleaning, one miserable month at a fish processing plant. Whenever she could, she found small carpentry work, fixing window frames, replacing rotted porch boards. But nothing that lasted. She'd been saving slowly, with the specific kind of patience that only comes from having nothing else to do with your evenings. And then Gordon told her to leave, and the savings felt very small and very far away all at once. She walked until the highway curved south, and a gas station appeared out of the gray afternoon. She went in to buy a coffee and stood at the bulletin board by the door, the kind with the plastic tabs you tear off, because she had learned, in the last few years, that bulletin boards were the best map of what a place actually needed. There was a posting for a dishwasher, a posting for a room for rent that was already fully torn of tabs, a handwritten notice about a missing orange cat named Biscuit, and at the very bottom, half covered by a flyer for a fiddle workshop, a small card printed on cream paper: Boathouse, Lakefront, Keppoch Road. Asking $8. Call Wendell Goat. Delia pulled out the card and stood there for a moment. $8. The gas station attendant, a teenager with headphones around his neck, glanced over at her. "You're not calling about the boathouse, are you?" She looked up. "Why?" He shrugged. "Nobody does. It's been on that board for about 8 months. There's something wrong with it." "What kind of something wrong?" He seemed to search for the right word. "People around here call it the Goat Place. Used to belong to old Wendell Goat's father. Before that, his grandfather." He paused. 2 people died in there. 2 people dying in a building doesn't make the building wrong," Delia said. He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. She bought her coffee and took the card outside and called the number. Wendell Goat was 83 years old and answered the phone on the first ring. He told her, without preamble, that the boathouse had been in his family for 60 years, and he was selling it because he was moving to his daughter's place in Truro, and he couldn't take it with him. He told her the price was $8 because he'd decided that anyone willing to pay $8 was serious, and anyone who wasn't serious would just make a mess of it. He told her there was no electricity, the roof had 2 soft spots, and the boat slip was warped shut. He told her these things the way a person recites a list, not selling, not apologizing, just stating. Then he said, "It's also where my grandfather and my uncle both died." There was a pause on the line. "Of what?" Delia asked. "Old age, both of them. In their sleep." Another pause. "People in this town get dramatic." She took the bus to Kepok the next morning. The town sat along the eastern shore of the lake like it had arrived there by accident and never quite organized itself into a proper shape. There was a main street with a hardware store, a bakery, a diner with a hand-painted sign, and a post office that also sold lottery tickets and fishing tackle. The houses were spread wide, the way houses get when land is cheap and nobody's in a hurry. Most had wood piles stacked against them, head high and tight, the universal signal that whoever lived there had done this before and knew what was coming. Wendell Goat met her at the end of Pelican Spit Road in a green rain jacket that had faded to the color of old moss. He was tall and slow-moving, with the particular deliberateness of someone who had stopped hurrying decades ago. He walked her down to the water without much conversation. The boathouse appeared around a stand of birches like a held breath. It was built right at the water's edge, partially on land and partially on wooden pilings over the lake. The structure was maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide, more than Delia had expected. The wood siding was weathered to silver, and lichen had taken over the lower third of the north wall. The boat slip doors at the water end were swollen shut, and one of the small windows on the lake-facing wall had a crack running diagonally through it, covered from the inside with electrical tape gone brown and brittle. Birch trees had grown up close on both sides, their white trunks bright against the darker building. Roofs held, Wendell said. Mostly. The two soft spots, Delia said. Northeast corner and directly above the old stove. I'll show you. He walked her through it. The interior smelled of old water and cedar and something older than both, a mineral smell like cold stone. The floor was wide plank fir, dark with age but solid when she stomped on it. There was a wood stove in the south corner, an iron thing from a different century, its pipe running up through the wall in a way that made Delia wince slightly. There was a long workbench along the east wall, built in, with a row of hand-forged hooks above it. At the water end, the boat slip was a rectangle of pale gray light, where the warped doors let in the November sky. The dock planking was visible below, floating a few inches off the water, which meant the float system still worked. She climbed up and pressed on the northeast roof boards with her palm, soft but not through. 6 inches of sag. How long has it been like this? She asked. 2 years, Wendell said. Maybe 3. I can fix it. He looked at her steadily. He didn't say, "Are you sure?" or "It's a big job." He just looked at her the way a person does when they're deciding if they believe you. "Albert Foss trained you?" he asked. She almost took a step back. "You knew Albert Foss?" "Knew of him. Had a reputation across 3 counties, a man like that." He looked at the roof. "All right, $8. She paid him in crumpled bills and coins. He wrote her a receipt on the back of a gas station receipt he had in his jacket pocket and told her the deed would take a few weeks but the land was hers from today. He shook her hand. His grip was dry and brief. "There's a story," he said, pausing at the door. "About this place. People might tell you. About my grandfather." He stopped. "What will they tell me?" Delia asked. "That he died here with something unfinished." He looked out at the lake for a moment. Stories like that tend to stick to a place, make people nervous. He left her standing there in the silver light, with the smell of old water and cedar all around her. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. She slept in a sleeping bag on the fir floor, with her jacket folded under her head, and she woke every morning to cold that had come in overnight from the lake. She ate from a camp stove she'd bought second-hand at the hardware store for $12. A decision she made with the seriousness of someone signing a contract. She made instant oatmeal with dried cranberries she found in the clearance bin at the grocery and told herself it was enough because it was. The roof was her first priority. She patched the soft spots with materials she sourced carefully, salvaged boards from a collapsed shed she'd spotted off the highway, priced at nothing because the farmer who owned it just wanted them gone. She borrowed a ladder from her nearest neighbor, a woman named Hazel. No, wait, we've used that name before. Her neighbor was a woman named Cora Pettingill, who had watched Delia walk down Pelican Spit Road 3 times before she came out to her front gate and asked, plainly, what was happening. Delia told her. Cora Pettingill was 67, widowed, and had the manner of someone who had decided a long time ago to take things at face value until proven wrong. She lent Delia the ladder without hesitation. She also, 3 days later, appeared at the boathouse door with a cast-iron pot of chowder and the information that her husband had been a roofer, and she had a box of leftover copper flashings in her barn that Delia was welcome to. "People are going to talk," Cora said, not unkindly, setting the pot on the workbench. "About you being here." "Because of the story about Wendell's grandfather?" Delia asked. "Partly." Cora looked around the interior with an expression that Delia couldn't quite read. Not fear, exactly. Something more like respect. Mostly because you're young and alone and you bought something nobody else would touch. People find that unsettling. Does it unsettle you? Cora considered this honestly. No, she said finally. I find it interesting. That was the beginning of something. We'll come back to it. The town of Kepuk watched Delia Marsh from a careful distance for the first month. She noticed it the way you notice weather, not each individual cloud, but the pattern of them. The conversations that slowed when she walked past the diner. The way the man at the hardware counter always had a second question after the first, just long enough to keep her there, while he worked out what kind of person she was. A woman at the post office who smiled at her too carefully, like a smile with an agenda behind it. She didn't try to explain herself. She bought her supplies, nodded when nodded at, and went back to the boathouse. What she was doing there was becoming visible from the road. She'd cleared the birches that had crowded up against the north wall. Not all of them, just the ones pressing on the siding, and stacked the cutwood near the door. She'd scraped back the lichen with a long-handled tool she'd made herself by lashing a mason's trowel to a broom handle, which had taken her 45 minutes and satisfied her deeply. She'd repaired the cracked window, replacing the glass herself after watching 2 tutorial videos on her phone at the library, and then arguing with both of them in her head until she understood why the glazing had to go in the order it did. The boat slip doors were the problem she kept circling back to. The wood had swollen in 2 different directions over 11 years, which meant they weren't just stuck. They were warped out of true. Forcing them would split them. She needed to dry them out, replane them, rehang them. It was going to take time, and the right tools and patience she had to ration carefully because the winter was coming in fast. She was standing in the slip, looking up at the door frames and making calculations in her head when she heard boots on the dock planking and turned to find a man she didn't recognize watching her from the dock. He was perhaps 70, stocky, with the red-knuckled hands of someone who worked outdoors. He introduced himself as Norbert Hadley, and he said he'd heard she was trying to open the slip. I built those doors, he said. With Wendell's uncle, back in. God, it must have been 1987, I know how they went in. She looked at him. Wendell's uncle, she said. The one who died here, yes. Norbert said it simply, no drama in it. He was a good woodworker. Taught me a fair bit, actually. He looked at the doors with something that was clearly memory, not fear. He never finished the project he started in here. Did Wendell tell you about it? She shook her head. There's a chest, Norbert said, somewhere in this building. He started building it, a sea chest, traditional maritime style, and he never finished it. He got sick before he could. He paused. People around here think that's why the place feels heavy, because something was left undone in it. Delia was quiet for a moment. Where is it? She asked. He would have stored it out of the way. Up high or in a compartment. Norbert looked around. I've never looked. Didn't feel right to come in without being asked. She looked at the workbench, at the row of hooks above it, at the way the bench was built, not flush against the wall, but with a gap behind it, like a space had been intentionally left. She went over and crouched down and looked underneath the bench. There it was. A chest, maybe 3 feet long and 18 inches deep, pushed against the wall in the darkness under the workbench. The wood was dry and dusty, white ash, she thought, with dovetail corners she could see even from here. The lid was a separate piece, fitted, not attached, and the lid was not finished. The carving on it, she could see it as she pulled the chest forward into the light, was about 2/3 complete. A pattern of waves and a compass rose, worked in low relief. The chisel marks stopped abruptly about 1/3 of the way across, the edge of an unfinished wave. Mid-motion, cut short. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Norbert crouched beside her. He was quiet. What was his name? Delia asked. Clifton Goat, Norbert said. Everyone called him Cliff. She ran her thumb along the finished carving. The lines were clean and confident, someone who had done this for years, who knew exactly where the chisel needed to go. She reached into her canvas roll and took out one of Albert Foss's chisels. The weight of it was the same as it always was. Solid, familiar. But she held it differently now, over this particular piece of work. Not the way you hold a tool, the way you hold something borrowed. You know how to do this kind of carving? Norbert asked. Albert Foss taught me, she said. He nodded, like that answered something he'd been wondering about for a while. She did not rush it. She spent 2 evenings just studying the pattern, the specific angle of Clifton Goat's cuts, the depth he used for the wave troughs versus the crests, the slight irregularity in his compass rose that told her he'd been freehanding it, not tracing. She practiced the same strokes on scrap pieces of ash she'd found at Cora's barn. She made mistakes on the scrap and learned from them, and made different mistakes and learned from those too, until the scrap boards were covered in practice marks and she trusted her hands again. Then she worked on the chest. It took her 11 days. She did other things in between. The door replaning was happening in parallel. She was patching gaps in the siding. She was slowly making the wood stove functional by cleaning the flue pipe and replacing the rusted collar. But the chest was the thing she came back to in the evenings, when the light through the lake-facing window turned gold and then gray, and the boathouse went quiet except for the water sounds. She finished the compass rose on a Thursday. She sat back and looked at it. It wasn't perfect. Her style was slightly different from Clifton's, a little more angular in the wave curves, a hair deeper in the relief. If you knew what you were looking for, you could see the seam, but you had to know. To anyone else it looked like one continuous piece of work. She didn't know why that mattered as much as it did, but it did. She set the chest in the middle of the boathouse floor, under the skylight she'd cleared the debris from, and she left it there for 3 days before she decided what to do with it. Then she went to find Wendell Goat's daughter. Her name was Patricia Goat. She'd kept the name, she said, because it was hers and she'd had it for 60 years and saw no reason to change it now. She lived in a tidy house on the east side of town with a wood stove of her own and a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for the winter under a layer of straw. She was maybe 65 with her father's deliberate way of moving and a directness that Delia found immediately comfortable. Delia told her about the chest, showed her a photograph on her phone. Patricia Goat looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. "Uncle Cliff," she said finally, quietly. "I finished the lid," Delia said. "I tried to match his work as closely as I could. If you'd rather I hadn't. If it feels wrong, I can leave the lid separate." "No." Patricia shook her head slowly. "No, I think he would have wanted it finished." She looked up. "Can I come see it?" She came the next morning, with Wendell, who moved through the boathouse doorway with the careful steps of someone returning to a place they hadn't been in years. He stood in the middle of the floor and looked around at what Delia had done: the patched roof, the cleared floor, the functional stove, the window glass replaced, the workbench cleaned and oiled. And then he looked at the chest. He didn't say anything for a while. Patricia put her hand on the lid, traced the compass rose with one finger. "He always said he was going to give it to someone who needed it," Wendell said at last. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. "Never said who." Delia looked at the two of them. "I'd like it to stay here," she said. "If that's all right with you, I think it belongs in this building." Wendell looked at her. The same look he'd given her on the first day. Assessing, unhurried. "All right," he said. Word moved through Keppoch the way word moves in small towns. Not as gossip exactly, but as weather. By the time December came in over the lake with its particular gray weight, people had started arriving on Pelican Spit Road not to look at the building, but at what was happening to it. The boat slip doors were open now, rehung and planed true, moving on their tracks without resistance. The silver siding had been treated with linseed oil and looked like it had woken up. A length of dock planking Delia had replaced was bright yellow gold against the weathered gray of the rest. Honest about being new, she'd kept it that way on purpose. She wasn't pretending the boathouse hadn't been what it had been. Norbert Hadley came back with his son, who had a sawmill outside of town and a surplus of air-dried white pine that he sold to her at cost, because, he said, he liked what she was doing. A woman named Beatrix Langlois, who had lived in Keppoch her whole life and had an opinion about everything, which she was kind enough to tell you whether you'd asked or not, arrived one afternoon with a box of old marine hardware she'd found in her late husband's shed, brass fittings and cleats, and a porthole window that had no business being in a shed in landlocked Nova Scotia. She left it all on the workbench without explanation and walked home. The porthole window Delia set into the south wall, above the wood stove, and the afternoon light came through it in a circle on the floor that moved across the furboards throughout the day like a slow clock. She noticed she was starting to know people's names. Not just Cora and Norbert and Patricia. The hardware counterman was named Guy Boileau, and he'd started setting aside salvage pieces for her without being asked. The woman at the post office with the careful smile was named Odette Spence, and she turned out to be careful because she was shy, not suspicious, and once Delia figured that out, they got along fine. There was a retired school teacher named Bertrand Moulazong, who came by once a week to watch her work and ask questions about joinery that were excellent questions, the kind that made her think harder about what she was doing. She started calling him Mr. Moulazong, and he started calling her by her name, and that was the shape of their friendship. One afternoon in late January, Cora Pettingill came to the boathouse with tea and sat on an overturned crate while Delia worked on a commissioned piece. Her first paid commission, a set of window shutters for a house on the west side of town, and said conversationally, "You know, people used to be afraid to walk down this road." Delia kept her eyes on the chisel. "Are they, still?" "No." Cora sipped her tea. "Now they walk down here to see what you're doing." There was a pause. "Is that better?" Delia asked, considerably. She thought about Albert Foss, who had walked into her mother's house on a Saturday morning and sat down at the kitchen table and asked if she wanted to learn something useful. No preamble, no explanation for why he'd decided this was a good idea. Just the offer, made plainly, and then the work that followed. She thought about Clifton Goat, who had started a chest he didn't finish, in a building that held the weight of that incompleteness for 40 years. She thought about the tools in her canvas roll. Albert's chisels, her own gouges she'd bought one by one, the small shoulder plane she'd traded 2 days of porch work for, and how they'd traveled with her from a house she'd been put out of, down a highway shoulder, to this place on a lake that $8 had made hers. "Don't waste energy on things you can't fix," Albert had told her once when she'd cried over a ruined piece of oak she'd cut wrong. "Assess what you have and start the work in front of you." She had started the work in front of her. By March, there were 3 more commissions. Small things, a repair job on a set of kitchen cabinets, a frame for a mirror, a set of bookshelves for the retired schoolteacher. But they were enough. They were more than enough, which she realized was a different thing from just enough, and different in a way that mattered. She went to see Wendell Goat one last time before he left for Truro. He was in his house, surrounded by boxes, moving through the rooms with the careful economy of someone saying goodbye to each thing as they packed it. He seemed glad she'd come. He put on the kettle without asking. They sat at his kitchen table, and he told her about his grandfather. The first goat to live at the Boathouse, who had fished the lake for 50 years and known the water the way some people know a language. Who had, in his last years, stopped going out because the boat made his joints ache, and had spent his time instead building the boathouse into what it was, adding the workshop section, raising the roof. Who had died there, at 91, in the room that was now the south end of the workshop, with the lake sounds outside the window, and every project finished except one. He'd meant to add a second dock, longer, for the grandchildren to fish from, and had run out of summer before he could. "So that's 2 people who died with something unfinished," Delia said. "That's the way it usually goes," Wendell said, without self-pity. "You run out of time before you run out of things you want to do." He looked at her over his tea. "The trick is to keep the list moving." She walked home along Pelican Spit Road in the March afternoon, the snow pulling back from the lake edge, and the ice going gray and porous in the sun. The birches were still bare, but there was something in the light that wasn't quite winter anymore. She could hear the lake. She hadn't been able to hear it all winter, under the ice, but now she could. The boathouse was waiting at the end of the road. The boat slip doors stood open, the way she'd left them, and the afternoon light came through and caught the surface of the water in the slip, moving, dark, alive. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. Inside, on the workbench, Clifton Goat's sea chest sat with its finished lid. The compass rose pointed north. The waves, cut by 2 different sets of hands, 60 years apart, ran toward an edge that no longer ended mid-motion. She went in and put on the stove and started the next day's work. That spring she built the second dock. Nobody asked her to. She just thought about Wendell's grandfather, who had wanted one, and Wendell, who had told her about it, with the mild tone of someone who has made peace with a thing, but still holds it somewhere. She used lumber she'd sourced from 3 different places. Some of it the yellow pine from Norbert's son, some of it salvage, some of it boards she'd milled herself from a birch that had come down in a February windstorm. It took her 3 weeks, working around the commissions and the cold. The dock was 12 feet long and ran south from the main dock, so it caught the afternoon sun. She built a small railing at the end because the water was deep there. When Wendell came back to visit Patricia in June, his daughter brought him down Pelican Spit Road for the first time in years. He stood at the end of the new dock and looked at the lake for a long time without speaking. Delia stood a little way behind, on the main dock, not wanting to intrude. "He would have built it just about like this," Wendell said finally. That was all he said. Some things don't need more words than that. We've been thinking, as we've told you this story, about the places we decide are done with us before they've had a chance to show us what they actually are. The boathouse at the end of Pelican Spit Road had been called cursed, unlucky, heavy, And maybe it was heavy, in the way that any place is heavy when something in it gets left mid-motion for too long. But Delia Marsh showed up with $37 and a canvas roll of tools, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had nothing to lose, and she started the work that was in front of her, and the place breathed out. That's all it had been waiting for. We'd like to ask you something before you go. Have you ever written off a place, or a person, that turned out to be worth the work? A thing everyone told you to walk away from, that you couldn't quite let go of? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone. And if this story stayed with you, if you heard something in it that felt a little like your own, we think you might want to be here for the next one.